Okay, Tov. Welcome to our introduction to Masechet Yevamot. I'm going to use the introduction of the Yalkut Biurim, which is here in the back of the Masifta. And again, if you have the possibility of investing in a Masifta, I think it's a good investment. It'll make life so much easier for us when I quote sources, footnotes, etc. So we're all on the same page. But in any event, he opens with a question as to why Seder Noshim, this is the first Masechet of Seder Noshim, comes before Seder Nezikin. And the Rambam, in his Pirush LaMishnayos, says that Rebbe organized Noshim before Nezikin based on the Seder Apsukim. Very interesting diuk that the Rambam has in the Seder Apsukim in Parshas Mishpatim. Because first comes Amevriya, and then comes the Nezikin of a Ki Igach, of Ki Notzu Anoshim V'Nogfu Ishahar. So the opening pasuk, in terms of Parshas Mishpatim, organizing the sequence between Noshim and Nezikin, are the following two psukim. One pasuk says, Ki Yimkar Ishes Bito Li Oma. Now, the mechira of a father, in the case of a daughter, and let's say she's a ketana, and he sells her as an omevriya, that's not just a monetary sale, although it does include, of course, monetary dimensions, but it's primarily a mechira leishus, and that has to do with the sug of yud, so that once he gives his daughter over as an omevriya, then the buyer could designate that woman, that his daughter, for a wife for his own son. So there's ishus involved over here. So omevriya and all the dinim of omevriya are incorporated into noshim. That comes before the pasuk of ki nogfu isha hara, and he has to pay dmei velados, etc., which are compensations for nezikin. And this, I believe, reflects the Rambam Shita over and over again, that Torah Shebal Peh, which, of course, in this case, Mishnayos that were authored by Rebbe, or at least edited by Rebbe, should mirror image the Torah Shebechsav, and therefore the sequence is as such. It doesn't seem that, according to the Rambam, there's any logical reason why Seder Noshim should precede Seder Nezikin. It's a flip a coin kind of choice. Why would one come before the other? I don't think you can come up with any compelling logical arguments why Noshim should come before Nezikin. I mean, there are marriage laws, then there are tort laws, civil laws as far as damages are concerned. I'm not sure which are more significant or sequentially, which have to know the logic of this in order to understand the logic of this. Perhaps one could have argued that Nezikin, in a certain sense, should have come first because it trains the mind. And we know that Chazal speak about teaching a child Nezikin because that will prepare him for learning everything else. But yet, Rebbe chose to put Noshim before Nezikin, and the Rambam says he was following the Seder Apsukim. However, other Rishonim, the Balei HaTosfos, have a different approach, and that's based on a Gemara in Masechet Shabbos. To answer the question as to why Rebbe put Noshim in front of Nezikin, the Balei HaTosfos see this as part of a more generic question as to the Seder of all 6 Sidrei Mishnah, all of which reflect the drasha of the Gemara in Masechet Shabbos. The Gemara darshans the pasuk, V'haya amunas itecha chosen yeshuos chachma v'das. And the Gemara goes through every word in this pasuk to allude to a different, respectively, a different part of the Seder HaMishnayos. And emunas itecha is a reference to Zraim, and it goes on and on. Itecha is an allusion to Seder Moed, and the Gemara explains why, because the word itim with an ayin indicates time periods, set time periods, and that's moed. And then chosein is called seder nashim because it strengthens the family unit and so forth and so on. And the Gemara goes through all these 6 words in the pasuk, and in the sequence of the pasuk, we actually have a reflection of the sequence of the 6 Sidrei Mishnah. And since the pasuk has chosein before Yeshuos, which means Nashim before Nezikin, therefore Rebbe organized it in that way. To be honest with you, in the light of that Gemara, I'm not sure why the Rambam couldn't have taken that path, but the Rambam is trying to find a mirror image to Torah B'chsav. That was the Rambam's challenge. And perhaps the easy way out would be this drasha in the Gemara in Shabbos. Now, before we get to the main question of today, why of Nashim, of all of Seder Nashim, Rebbe chose to begin with Masechet Yevamos? Let's just ask a smaller question. And that is, why does he call it Yevamos in the plural? He could have called it Masechet Yevama. And the one who actually addressed this question, which seems like such a secondary question, is the Sefer Chinuch, one of the Rishonim. And he writes that the Mishnah was choosing between 2 words, Yevamos and Chalutzos, because we'll see later on that we're going to have long discussions and an analysis of the status of a Chalutza. That means in event that the brother, the Yavam, decides to opt for Chalitza, and he gives Chalitza to his Yevama, she becomes a Chalutza. And the question is, what's the status of a Chalutza vis-a-vis Kahuna? So since when you're dealing with the status of an individual, we talk about a group, we don't talk about Rachel or Leah, therefore the word Chalutzos would have been chosen. So now the Sefer Chinuch asks, so why not start with the Masechta Chalutzos? And the answer is because the Gemara says, Mitzvahs Yibum kodemes lemitzvahs Chalitza. That in an ideal state, when he has this choice of either Yibum or Chalitza, he should opt for Yibum. So the word Yevamis, flip side of the word Chalutos, is going to be the choice for Rebbe to begin and to name this Masech. The Rambam in the Pirush HaMishnayos wants to understand why Masech Yevamis comes prior in the Seder HaMishnayos in Noshim to both Ksubis and Kiddushin. And offhand, the Rambam says Ksubis and Kiddushin should have come first, because Kiddushin represents the Maisa Nesuin, the Maisa Erisin, meaning to create Erisin. That's the first stage of marriage. And it clinches with the Ksuba. The Ksuba is Nesuin. When he takes her under the chuppah, he gives her a Ksuba. And now he's ready for the mitzvah of Piri Verivia, when he completes the marriage, the issues with Nesuin. And Yibum is going to occur after marriage in an event that the almana dies and the brother that was married to this woman died without leaving any children. So that's a later stage which generates the mitzvah of Yibum. So the Rambam comes up with the following logic. Certainly Ksubis, which is full-fledged marriage, L'Masechta Yevamis, because only after marriage is there a possibility of Yibum. Ela shemitzvahs Yibum, he mitzvah shebezdin kofin es ha'adam lasos. He says the following, that when Rebbe chose the Seder HaMishnayos, he was influenced by the following, shall we say, literary premise. and that is that he's addressing himself to the Bezdin. Of course, every Jew has to learn Mishnayos, and all Shisha Sidri Mishnayos, Vishinantam Levanecha, doesn't apply specifically to the Bezdin. But the Bezdin are in charge of overseeing the implementation of the mitzvos, and therefore they are the prime target of the Mishnah. It's an interesting point that the Rambam is making. For example, we'll find in Masechet Ksubis that instead of beginning with the Ksub itself, that Masechta begins by setting it up in a way that Bezdin could make a final decision as to whether she deserves the Ksub or she doesn't deserve the Ksub. And in that sense, she has to get married on a Wednesday. Bezdin is going to sit on Thursday. And again, the Seder within the Masechta is organized according to the Rambam's interpretation of Rebbe, addressing the Bezdin. Now, herein lies the difference between Masechta Yevamot on the one hand and Kiddushin and Ksubis on the other hand. There's no such thing as kfiyah with regard to marriage. The normal halacha that kofen also with regard to mitzvahs is suspended in the case of marriage. A person has to make a decision on his own. He found himself a marriage partner that he thinks is suitable, and he goes and he gets married. We cannot beat him up and force him to get married. Some might say, chaval, too bad. Maybe we could solve the shidduch crisis today if we had kfiyah on getting married. But Yevamot, from that perspective, plays the role of a classic Masechta. And moreover, we already have a woman, and now's a good time to introduce the concept of tzkuka liyavam, otherwise known as a shomeres yavam, which is a woman, after her husband dies and leaves no children, she can't get married to anyone because her late husband, left a brother. And the halach is very harsh over here. The brother might be 1 day old at the time that his older brother died. And she is kukal yavam, she's shomeres yavam, yavam l'shuk, different terminologies to refer to the same woman. She can't get married until one of two things happen. Either she gets yibum or she gets chalitza. So in that case, Bezdin will force him. They'll say, look, we can't force you to marry her, but you have another choice. And we'll force you to choose one of these two alternatives, either yibum or chalitza. So in that sense, Masechta Yevamot is addressing Bezdin, whereas Kiddushin and Ksuba is really not the area of Bezdin, because as far as marriage is concerned, it's no kfiyah. However, other Rishonim, and he has here in the footnote a Tosfos in Moed Katan and a Tosfos Yeshanim, they are also bothered by the fact that Rebbe starts Seder Noshim with Yevamot, and they come up with what I call a more hashkafic explanation for the Seder Advar. And this has to do with a kasha that the Rishonim raise with regard to Masechta Yevamot. The entire background of Masechta Yevamot, meaning the scenario that generates the mitzvah of Yibum, is what we call perennials. A man dies without leaving any children. And we have a principle which is formulated by the Gemara in Moed Katan and also Baba Basra, Aschule beparenusa lo maschalinon. Unless there's another compelling reason, we do not begin anything with perennial. So why begin all of Moed with this tragic story, this perennials of a man dying without children? And they offer the following answer. Rebbe, when he begins a Seder in Mishnayos, he wants to link up with the previous Seder. So we had Zroim, Then we had Moed, and now we have Noshim. The last Masechta in Seder Moed is Moed Katan. And the subject of the second half of Moed Katan is in itself Peronios, because all the laws of Agelus are incorporated into the second half of Masechta Moed Katan. So now Rebbe is at a crossroads. On the one hand, Aschule beparnusa lo maschulin. On the other hand, Rebbe has this overriding principle in the literary structure of Mishnayos that he wants to link up a new Seder with the previous Seder. And in this case, he has a choice of various Masechtas in Noshim, and he has to choose one of them. And the best candidate is going to be the one that could link up with the previous Seder, namely Seder Zmanim. And in the case of Seder Zmanim, which concludes with Moed Katan, namely Paranusa, he's going to choose that Masechta in Noshim that revolves around Paranusa. The scenario that generates Yibum is Paranusa. And that's going to be the first item on the agenda for Rebbe, to link up one Seder with the previous Seder. And in that sense, we now have an answer to the Rambam's question as to why Rebbe chose Masechta Yevamos amongst all the other options. Wouldn't Ksubis be a better option? Dealing with Nisuin, marriage comes before Yibum, and that compelled the Rambam to introduce the idea of Bezdin, that whereas in Kedushin, Bezdin play no role vis-a-vis the Kiyum mitzvah to enforce the mitzvah, but in the case of Ksubit, of Yevamos, Rebbe is addressing the Bezdin, the Batei Dinim, because Kofin ala Yibum, Yibum or Chalitza, and the other Rishonim say no. First, you answer the question about Eschuli v'Paranusa lo maschalina. And until you give me an answer to that question, I'm not interested in hearing about kfir, whether there is kfir in Bezdin and Bezdin can be going. That's irrelevant to me. I want to know how Rebbe could violate the rule that's formulated explicitly by the Gemara Bava Basra that we don't begin with Peronios. And your answer about kfir, Ramam, is not sufficient. So the Baliatosis are going to go down a whole different route. Once we answer the question how we can start a Seder of Mishnayos with Parnusa, then I don't even have a question as to why Yevamos will come before Ksubis. The Rambam's question is no longer a question, because Rebbe preferred to link up this Seder with the last Seder. And that to Rebbe was top on the agenda. But now he quotes a Tosas Yeshanim. The Tosas Yeshanim says the following: that there are two dimensions to Jewish marriage. There's what we call Heter Nisuin and what we call Iser Nisuin, otherwise known as Arayos. And we have a principle called Sor Mira Asei Tov. To appreciate Jewish marriage from a halachic perspective, we have to know what are the options, meaning what ladies could get married to these potential suitors. In other words, first we have to clear the way as far as Iser Arayos is concerned, and then we can talk about marriage. And I think I could add the following. In the bracha of marriage, Asher Asa Lonos Harusos, V'hito Lonos Hanesus Lono Ayidei Chuppah V'Kedushin. So we start with our Arayos, those Isurim, and then we go on to marriage. And the bracha ends with Mekadesh Yisrael Ayidei Chuppah V'Kedushin. So basically, we have to present Isurei Bia, and then we go on to the laws of marriage. Now, this approach will answer another question. The Mishnah at the beginning of Masechet Yevamos does not begin telling me when there is a mitzvah of Yibum. Under what circumstances is a woman what we call nofeles liyibum? There's an afilo liyibum. She falls for Yibum and she receives Yibum. But rather, strangely enough, the Mishnah is going to begin with a list of 15 different scenarios in which Yibum is impossible. And there is no nefila for Yibum. And that's the Chamesh Yisrei Noshim at the beginning of Masechet Yevamos. Why? Why tell me when there's no nefila Yibum and you haven't even told me anything about nefila Yibum? The logical progression would demand that we begin with the mitzvah of Yibum and then tell me these are the exceptions. But I think this Tos Yishanim gives us a little clue. Rebbe chose Masechet Yevamos first because of all the Masechtas in Noshim, in Seder Noshim, the one that gives us the most insight into our rayos is Masechet Yevamos. If you're learning Hilchas Isurei Bia, then you're not going to open up Masechta Kedushin, you can open up Masechta Yevamos. And that explains why Rebbe began with the 15 categories of our rayos where Yibum does not apply. Based on this principle, at first, Mashmiim Hanoshim Hasuras Lanu, and then we get to Noshim HaMutaris Lanu B'Nesuin, and also, in this case, in Yibum. And finally, we have a very, very odd answer to this question as to why Rebbe begins with Masechet Yevamos. I find this very interesting. The law and the mitzvah of marriage of Masechet, the subject of Masechet Kedushin, appears no earlier in the Torah than Parshas Ki Teitzei. But Yibum appears way back when in Sefer Bereshis, in the parsha, the great episode of Yehuda and Tamar, in which Yehuda, after his son Er dies, he gives her Onen, and then he himself is Miyabim her, although he doesn't know that at the time. But the basic concept of Yibum predates Matan Torah. In fact, one of the issues that I saw in the Schattenstein Gemara, they have an introduction here. They want to know what's the reason for Yibum. It seems like a very strange halacha, and they point to a whole list of commentaries. Maybe at some point we'll get it. He doesn't give you the summary of any of those commentaries. We got a list of about 6 or 7 perushim, including the Malbim and Rameir, all of them, and they all try to understand the mechanism of Yevamos and why the brother is obligated to marry his late brother's wife and so forth and so on. What's the philosophy behind it? And they all go back to the parsha of Yibum that came before the Torah. And that's the parsha of Yehuda B'Tamar. Now the Meiri has an introduction to Masechet Yevamos, and he writes the following: B'chol seder misedrei hashas, hiktim Rebbe as hamasechta chamura tchila. Interesting. In every seder, Rebbe chooses the most difficult and the most intellectually challenging masechta to start with. Lachein posach seder zroim b'brachos. Obviously, brachos is a masechta that encompasses so much, and then we go on to other masechtas which are more limited, like challah and orla and so forth and so on. Es Seder Moed Hischil, Rebbe chose Masechta Shabbos, obviously the most complicated Masechta that's makif so much in Moed. Ubeseder Noshim Pasach b'Masechta Yevamos hachamura. The most challenging Masechta in Seder Noshim is Yevamos. And I would add the comment, if you don't believe the Miri about that, try to get through the first Mishnah in Masechta Yevamos. I have basically, at this point in my preparation, I can talk to you about maybe 2 or 3 out of the 15 cases I can talk to you intelligently in the first Mishnah in Masechta Yevamos. I imagine that we'll finish the first Mishnah in Masechta Yevamos within a week. That's how optimistic I am. Because I want to convince myself that I understand these cases. And they're very complicated. Sometimes they involve 10 different people marrying this one and that one and that one and his child. And now, as a pedagogue, my intuition would say start with the easy Masechta first. Don't throw someone for a loop. I learned Daf Yomi, and I say to myself, gee, if Rebbe had started with Shkolim, I would have dropped out of Masechta of Seder Moed. I mean, it's like impossible, Shkolim. But I think what the Meiri is arguing is that if you get by the first Masechta and you do a good job, then the rest of the Masechtas within that Seder are relatively easy. Alternatively, maybe the Meiri means that every Masechta has its own methodology, its own principles, and its own discipline. And the most chamur is always the Masechta that will teach you the methodology of the thinking of that discipline, of that Seder. So that if you really want to understand Masechta Ksubas, Masechta Kiddushin, Masechta Gittin, first get the principles down in Masechta Yevamos. Now, as you know, on the classic Mishnayos, that's before Kahati came into existence, there was somebody called Heller. His name was the Tosas Yontif. And he writes, Hikdim Rebbe Masechta Yevamos, L'Ksubis, U'L'Kiddushin, Mishum Mispar HaMitzvahs. Interesting. Give chashivus to a subject, to a mitzvah that has more weight in Hilchas mitzvahs, when you're counting mitzvahs, than to another Masechta that has less. So both Ksubis and Kiddushin have one basic mitzvah, and that is Peri V'Rivya. I'm not getting into the whole question whether Kiddushin is a separate mitzvah than Peri V'Rivya, or it's only an introduction, a preliminary to Peri V'Rivya, whatever it is. But the mitzvah is one mitzvah. In the case of Yevamos, there are 2 mitzvahs here. There's mitzvah Peri V'Rivya, which is certainly prominent, but equally prominent is the mitzvah of Yibum per se, L'Hakim Shem Li'achiv Shemes. Now, here's another question. Now, the next question in terms of Rebbe and how he organized the Mishnayos, this question requires that we know the second Mishnah in Masechta Yevamos. The second Mishnah in Masechta Yevamos, which is a continuation of the first Mishnah, also listing prohibited women, there the Mishnah uses the word arayos. And here in our Mishnah, it says Chameshes Noshim. Tosas wants to know, why does our Mishnah begin with Noshim and the second with arayos? The second Mishnah starts, Sheish arayos chamuros mi'elu. So you have the 15 arayos, and then you have an upgrade of 6 additional arayos, which are even more chum. But what's common to both the list of the 15 in our Mishnah and the list of 6 in the next Mishnah is that they're all arayos. Why didn't Rebbe use the word arayos and be consistent? And Tosfos comes up with the sugya that the number 15, which is mentioned in our Mishnah, is coming lafuke to exclude another list of women whom, even though they're not misyabmos, but they don't. Again, this is going to sound gibberish to you if you've never learned Yevamot, but so just hear the words. I mean, just let it roll off your top of your head. We'll get to it as soon as we start the Mishnah. But there are other women that are asuros b'yibum, but their tsaros are not asuros b'yibum. Einon pochus es tsaroseim b'yibum v'chalitza. If the Mishnah, says Tosfos, would have started the word arayos, then lo shona hatana loshna raiski ima yeshona, had he used the word arayos, lo haya b'mashmos haminyan miut lemait noshim elohaya mishtameh mimenu miut l'arayos acheros. In other words, there are women who don't fall for yibum, but not because they're arayos. And if the Mishnah would have used the term arayos here, then we would have understood that there are only 15 arayos, to the exclusion of other arayos. But that's not true. All arayos are both mafkia yibum, they make yibum impossible, and they generate an iser of tsaras eruv. But we have another group of nashim that, although they themselves do not fall for yibum, but Edom Pochos is Tsaroseya because they are not begetter arayos. So therefore, Rebbe chooses the word nashim to indicate that these 15 nashim have a special status, and they patter up their tzara from yibum. Is tsaras 15 nashim, as we'll soon see, also Edom misyamos. But if Rebbe would have chosen the word arayos, we would have assumed that there are 15 arayos out of X number of arayos. There's a larger number of a group of arayos, and we're going to focus on 15 out of those. That's not so, because all arayos. So if Rebbe wants to set up a contrast, 15 as opposed lafuki others, and we always know that whenever Rebbe uses a number, he's coming to exclude others, he's excluding other nashim who are not arayos from the din of partnering up their tzaros. Whereas if Rebbe would have used 15 arayos, it would have indicated that there are more arayos, but they don't partner up their tzara. That's not so, because there are only the 15 plus the next 6, and that's the gag. Those include all the arayos. And that again reflects what we said earlier, that could be sur meirah, that the reason why Rebbe starts Seder Noshim with Masechet Yevamot is because the laws of arayos are right here, and all the categories of Noshim arayos are to be studied right here. Okay. Now, what exactly, I'm going to just mention this as part of our introduction, but it really requires a tremendous amount of knowledge in Masechet Yevamot, which at least I don't have. Maybe you have. I don't have. But let's just throw it out there. Halacha is that the Chamesh Esrei Noshim that we're about to learn about, the Gemara says that we derive from a certain limud, Alfutza, Gzeira Shava, that there is no yibum in these 15 scenarios that we're going to discuss. Says Reb Shimon Shkab, and you know he lived just less than 100 years ago. He probably died, I'm just guessing, around 1940. I'm just throwing out a number. So Reb Shimon Shkab wants to know when we're going to learn this list of 15 women that are excluded from Yibum, what is it? Is it because the Iser Erva makes it impossible for them to fall to Yibum? Or the mitzvah of Yibum doesn't apply in this case? It's not because of the Iser Erva that blocks Yibum, but the Hafkas mitzvah Yibum. We must have a mitzvah of Yibum in order to allow Yibum to take place. The matir of Yibum is mitzvah Yibum. And the Alfusa that we're going to derive, which is the Sugya Daf Gimel, excludes these cases from the mitzvah of Yibum. So again, one way of understanding our Mishnah is that the Torah allowed a Yavam to marry his sister-in-law, which under normal circumstances would be prohibited. Let's say, for example, if Reuven's married to Leah and he has a child with Leah, or he had a child from a previous marriage, and then he dies, leaving Zerah behind, and then his brother Shimon cannot marry Leah because she's Achos Achiv. I'm sorry, Ashes Achiv. And Ashes Achiv is an Isur Kares, a classic Erev in the full sense, which the Torah permitted in the case of Yibum. So if Shimon is saying, you could say that the Torah only permitted that Erev called Ashes Achiv, but if on top of that it's Bito or Bas Bito or whatever the cases will have, then the Torah wasn't matir those are rights. Or no, that's not the way it works. If the Torah was matir Ashes Achiv, then the Torah could be matir for the sake of Yibum any Erev. But there's no mitzvah of Yibum. The Alfus is telling me that the power, the agent which overrides the Isur Kares is the mitzvah of Yibum. And the mitzvah of Yibum doesn't apply in these cases. So I think we'll be more intelligent and we'll appreciate the analysis of Reb Shimon when we get to the Sugya Daf Gimel that derives this Mishnah from a Gzeira Shavah. So without further ado, let's begin the first Mishnah in Yevamot. Chameshesrei Noshim Potros Soroseim Vitzoros Soroseim and Achalitzim and Ayibum at Sofa Ola. So first we have Soroseim. And we'll talk about the simple, what hopefully will be the simple case of a tzara. And then we have the more complicated case of tsaros tzara, or tsaros tzara, same in the plural. So first we start with Soroseim. So what's the case of a tzara? The case of a tzara is when a man marries his niece. Right? If a man marries his niece, we could give names as we go along, then he's marrying his brother's daughter, which is okay. But when he dies, when the uncle dies, if you follow what I mean, and he leaves no children, his wife, Ke'ilu, falls for Yibum in front of her own father. And that's going to be the first case here in the 15 cases, Bito. So he has a little bit of a diagram here. He says that Yaakov is the father. He has two sons, Reuven and Shimon. And Shimon marries Sarah. And when Shimon dies, if he leaves no children, Sarah falls to Yibum to Reuven. So that's your classic scenario of Yibum. But now we have a case where Shimon marries Sarah, but Sarah is the daughter of his brother Reuven. And therefore, when Shimon dies, leaving no children, his wife Sarah falls to Yibum to her own father Reuven, and that's called Bito. And in the case of Bito, there is no Yibum. So far, so good. So he has the following diagram here. He has Yaakov has two sons, Reuven and Shimon. And Shimon marries Sarah. Just give me a second here because I have this. Okay, so Sarah, in the first case in our Mishnah, is the daughter of Reuven. Shimon dies. Sarah falls for Yibum to Reuven. That's Bito. That's Bito. Now, let's go back to the drawing board. And Reuven and Shimon are brothers. Shimon marries Sarah, the daughter of Reuven, and he marries Rivka. I mean, this is before Cherem D'Rabbeinu Gersh, right? Now, I understand that Sarah does not fall to Yibum to her father Reuven. But what about Rivka? Every wife potentially needs Yibum. And Rivka is not related to Reuven other than the fact that Rivka is Shimon's wife. But that's when the mitzvah of Yibum applies. So this is called Tsaroseyen. Rivka is a tsara to Sarah. Okay, so that makes sense. He writes here, Nasa Shimon es Sarah, v'hi achas mi chameshes krovos, shasuros al Ruvain achiv, v'chein Nasa es Rivka. Meis Shimon below banim, naflu nashav lifnei Ruvain liyibum, Sarah poteres, Sarah petura min ayibum v'chalitza, shum erva, upoteres gam es Rivka tzarasa michalitza v'yibum, mishum tzaras erva. And he adds a note here, B'gemara daf gimel darshu zos min apasuk litzar shegam tzaras erva petura michalitza v'yibum. It's interesting that he always makes the point in the context of our Mishnah to mention both Yibum and Chalitza, because it could be that we'll get to certain scenarios where, although Yibum is not possible, but nevertheless there's a need for Chalitza. Okay. Now, let's see if I could get the next case. This is a little bit more complicated. Ruvain onas isha. So we're not dealing with marriage. Veholid mimena es Sarah. So Sarah was born to Ruvain illegitimately. So Sarah is the daughter of Ruvain, and Vinisa Sarah, Bito shel Ruvain, l'Shimon achiv. So Shimon marries Sarah, and that's exactly what we said from the get-go, except we thought Sarah was the daughter of Ruvain through another marriage or whatever. But that's not the case he's dealing with. He's dealing with a case where Sarah is the daughter of Ruvain through an illegitimate relationship. So Shimon marries Sarah, who is the daughter of his brother Ruvain, and he marries Rivka. Shimon dies without children. Eino choletzes v'eino misyabebes liavia Ruvain achi ames v'chein poteres hi es Rivka tzarasa ve'es tzaras tzarasa. We didn't get to tzaras tzarasa, but at least we got to the case of tzarasa because Shimon was married not only to Sarah, the daughter of Ruvain, but also to Rivka. So when Shimon dies, we have to deal with both Sarah and Rivka, vis-a-vis Nafil Yibam in front of Ruvain. Sarah is the daughter of Ruvain. There's certainly no possibility of Yibam, but what about Rivka? Rivka is not related to Ruvain in any way, except for the fact that she was married to his brother. But the answer is that Rivka is a Sarah to Sarah. That's called the Tzaras Erev. Okay, so far we have the case of Tzaras Erev. Now let's just try an experiment. At the end of this list, or almost at the end of the list, I should say, we have the case of Eshes Achiv Me'imo. Okay, now how do we get a case of Eshes Achiv Me'imo? So in the Masifta, and again, I would encourage you, if you can, to get a hold of it, so we'll both be looking at the same diagram. He's got a diagram of Eshes Achiv Me'imo. Let's see if we can figure this out. First, we'll read the text, because I think it's always good to read the text, and then we'll take a look at the diagram. As the diagram is always very complicated unless you get familiar with the diagrams, which hopefully we will. He says the following. Nasa Yaakov es Leah. Yaakov marries Leah. V'yoldalo es Shimon. Okay, that sounds biblical, right? That Yaakov is married to Leah, and they have a son, Shimon. Avram nasa es Rachel. V'yoldalo es Yitzchak. Okay. So Yaakov is married to Leah, and they give birth to Shimon. Avram is married to Rachel, and they give birth to Yitzchak. Meis Avram bin Nasa Yaakov es Rachel al Menasa. So Yaakov now marries the almana of Avram, and that's Rachel. V'yoldalo es Reuven. So now Reuven and Shimon are paternal brothers. They have the same father. But Reuven is the son of Rachel, where Shimon is the son of Leah. So Reuven and Shimon do not share the same mother, they share the same father. Now, we said that after Avram married Rachel, he had Yitzchak. Nasa Yitzchak es Rivka. Okay, I don't see that Rivka, was on the agenda till now, so I don't assume she's related to anyone else here. But in any event, Yitzchak marries Rivka. That's also biblical. Umes. And Yitzchak now dies. Okay. V'nosa Shimon es Rivka ishto. And now Shimon marries the wife, the widow of Yitzchak. Shekain eno achi Yitzchak lo me'av lo me ha'em. So Shimon is not related to Yitzchak, neither from the father nor from the mother. Now, Mace Shimon below Banim. Shimon dies without any children. And Shimon is married to Rivka, right? The widow of Yitzchak. Nafla ishto Rivka, lifnei Ruvain shu achiv me'a'av, right? We said that Yaakov had married Leah, and they gave birth to Shimon. Yaakov married Rachel, and they gave birth to Reuven. So Reuven and Shimon have the same father. They're brothers from Yaakov. Okay. Now Shimon dies, so his wife Rivka falls to Yibum to his brother Reuven. Harehi ktura mimenu miyibum u michalitza. Rivka is patur for Yibum from Reuven. Mishum shemilvad heyos Asa Shimon achim me'amav, because Rivka, in addition to being Reuven's brother's wife, in other words, Reuven's widow, and Reuven l'chora should be able to be miyabim Rivka, but gam haisa eshes Yitzchak, but at the same time, Rivka was married to Yitzchak. Now, what's the relationship between Reuven and Yitzchak? So we said before that Yaakov, second, I'm sorry, that Avram married Rachel and had a child named Yitzchak. So now he says, and then this is the punchline. If I can figure this out, then I have it. He says that Rivka is related to Reuven as Achiv min ha'em. They share the same mother. Just one second. I'm trying to figure out why is it that Reuven and Yitzchak share the same mother? That I don't remember that. Let's just go over that again. We know that Reuven was the son of Yaakov and Leah. Just one second. Again, Nasa Yaakov is Leah. Yodelo es Shimon. Avram Nasa es Rachel, Yodelo es Yitzchak. Umeis Avram. V'nasa Yaakov es Rachel al Menoso. So Yaakov married the almana of Reuven. I'm sorry, I meant to say the almana of Avram. V'yodelo es Reuven. So again, who is Reuven's father? Was Yaakov. And who is Shimon's father? Yaakov. So Reuven and Shimon are brothers. That I understand. They both have the same father. Now we have to figure out. Just one second. Now we have to figure out the relationship between Reuven and Rivka. So one second. Rivka. So Yitzchak married Rivka, and Rivka is what? Rivka is Esha Shimon, that I understood. And Nasa Yitzchak es Rivka umes. So Rivka is the widow of Yitzchak, but she's also now Nasa Shimon es Rivka Ishto. So Rivka is not only the almana of Yitzchak, but she's also the almana of Shimon. Okay, fine. Now Shimon dies, and Rivka falls to Yibum to Reuven. But Milvad Heyosa Eshes Shimon, Gam Eshes Yitzchak, Gam Eshes Yitzchak, Rivka was married to Yitzchak, Shu Achiv Me'a'em. Oh, so this is where the key comes in. Yitzchak is a brother to Reuven. How is Yitzchak a brother to Reuven? Let's try to figure that out. Because Reuven was the child of Yaakov and Leah. No, who is Reuven? Yaakov married Rachel and had Reuven. So Reuven's mother was Rachel. Shimon's mother was Leah. Okay? So now, when Shimon marries Rachel, when Shimon marries Rivka, then when Rivka falls to Yibum after Shimon's death to Reuven, then she was the almana of Yitzchak, and Yitzchak is achiv me ima. So therefore, Eshes ach asur mishum erva, bein vi Eshes ach min ha'av, bein vi Eshes ach min ha'em. Ubi Eshes ach min ha'em, she'ein mitzvahs yibum, nish'eres hi be'isur Eshes ach. So Belina, tomorrow we'll go over this one more time. So we have, because I want to use this as one example of the 15 cases in the Mishnah. All right, then? So let's just review. We discussed why Rebbe began Seder Moed with Yevamos, and why Masechet Yevamos begins with Nashim. We discussed the fact that Masechet Yevamos is perhaps linked up to Seder Moed with Peranios. We discussed the fact that in Chumash, Nashim comes before Nezikin. We discussed the fact that Yevamos is more complicated, but perhaps sets the methodology for the rest of Nashim. And the fact that Sur Mirav Asei Tov, that first we begin with our Rayos, and then we go on to marriage. Now we're ready for the list of the Mishnah of 15 cases of Arayos that not only exempt themselves from Yibum, but also that Tzara, and then we'll get on to the next stage of Tzaras Tzara. Okay, then? That's what we have as a little bit of dipping our feet, our toes into the waters of Yevamos. Okay, then? Everyone should have a great day.